Hello. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And I drove here today, well, I was driven here today, and guys, this is remote. And I have lived in New England. I lived in New England for 6 years, and I have seen this kind of New England, but solidarity for each and every one of you that can't get out. But it's a pleasure to be here. I went on the little main street, Spring Street, and then I was like, okay, where's the next part of it? But that was it. But it's very cute and very quaint. And there's a lot of snow everywhere. I forgot to read the weather before I left my house in Indiana, where we're having really weird global warming winter, and it's 60 degrees. So I was like, sure, it's going to be 60 degrees in Boston. But I am really excited to share from my new book tonight, and then they asked me to talk. And so I'm going to talk about, I guess, current events and get real militant on you. But my current book that was out last month is called Difficult Women, because I'm a difficult woman. And my dad, I was sitting with him over break, and I didn't want to do something he wanted me to do. He wanted me to go play golf with him, which I know, we're black, but he was like, you are being very difficult, like your book, ha ha ha. And I was like, that's exactly right. And so this is actually the very first book I ever tried to sell, and it took 7 years to get published. And now I feel really good about that, because everyone who said no is like really angry. Suckers! And so I'm going to read you a story about yogurt. And I'm often asked why I write a given story, and people expect some profound intellectual answer. But I was watching a commercial for Activia with Jamie Lee Curtis, and I thought, I want to be that happy. I just want to be as happy as Jamie Lee Curtis is because of this Activia. And then I tried Activia, which I don't recommend, because it does exactly what the commercial says it's going to do. And I decided to write a story instead. The first time I read this story, a woman in the audience got sick and threw up. So I was so happy about that. This is called Open Marriage. We are having a heated debate about whether or not yogurt can expire when my husband suggests we stay together but see other people. He says open marriage intrigues him, that he couldn't be happier, but he read this article online this one time. I tell him yogurt can't expire because it's filled with bacteria. I don't know if this is true, but I have seen yogurt commercials that mention things like bacteria and the word probiotic, so I feel like I have a sufficient command of the topic. I give him a look. I say he's welcome to try to find other women to sleep with, but I'm fine. And his face falls because he thinks I'm playing a trick on him. I'm not. He has no game, none at all. If I hadn't taken matters in hand, we would still be sitting on his couch in his bachelor apartment, his arms snaking around my shoulders with every yawn. I'm not worried. He's the kind of man who gets ideas but is unable to follow through. As we're talking, he shoves his hands into his jeans. This is something he does often, wearing right through the pockets of most of his pants. He leans against the kitchen counter. He says he wants cultivating an open marriage to be something we do together. I politely decline once more. I say, look, I'm not inclined to open up my half of the marriage, which only confuses him further because I'm quick-tempered and what he calls feisty, which means I talk back to him and give him roadhead every once in a while. And I'm the first woman who has ever done that in his limited experience, so it's still something of a novelty. It's still something that requires terminology. I take a bite of the yogurt that started our scientific debate. It expired more than 2 months ago, but it sort of appears edible. When I dip my spoon into the container, the yogurt gives way easily. It's sour. My husband's face is red and sweat beads on his upper lip. He asks if I would seriously be fine with him having no strings attached sex with another woman, and I say, yes, baby, of course. He tells me I'm amazing in bed, that it's not about being unsatisfied, and I say, yeah, baby, of course. I rock his world on the regular, and we both know it. He can barely string 3 words together after we make love. He just lies there trying to catch his breath, muttering, "God damn," over and over. I say, "Good luck and be safe, and don't you break my heart, baby. Don't you break my heart." His eyes widen. I eat the entire container of yogurt, even going so far as to scrape the sides until it is clean. I vocalize my appreciation for this expired yogurt and do a lot of elaborate spoon licking. I hold my husband's gaze the entire time. He was a virgin when we married, so he looks away first. Thank you. About 17 years ago, my parents moved into a gated community in Naples, Florida, and we're from the Midwest, and so we lived in a normal neighborhood. Didn't even know that gated communities exist, but there are these fascinating communities where people lock themselves in, and everybody in Florida lives in a gated community. Even if you live in a shitty neighborhood, the gate just sort of keeps the shitty in. And so I wrote a series of vignettes about well, it's not their neighborhood, but it's their neighborhood. And it's called Florida. 3333 Palmetto Crest Circle. The adjustment had been uncomfortable. All her life, Marcy had lived in the Midwest with people who ate red meat and starchy foods, who allowed their bodies to spread without shame. And then her husband was transferred to Naples. Marcy's mother said, "Naples like in Italy?" And Marcy said, "No, Florida." And her mother said, "Oh dear." The women in Naples all looked the same, lean and darkly tan, their faces narrow with hungered discipline, whittled by the same surgeon. They stared at Marcy's relatively ample physique with disgust or envy or something between the two. At night, Marcy worried about her ass and thighs. Her husband always said, "Baby, you are perfect," and she flushed angrily. His assurances were so reflexive as to be insulting. In Omaha, they lived in a neighborhood. In Naples, they moved into a gated community, Palmetto Landing, where each estate was blandly unique and sprawling. Tall facades, lots of glass and balustrades around the window, Spanish tiles on the roofs, the streets cobbled with tiny square bricks. The first time they drove up to the gatehouse, manned by a white-haired gentleman in polyester, Marcy leaned forward to study the landscaping, tall cypresses encircled by Peruvian lilies looming over the guardhouse. She sighed, said, "This is a bit much." Her husband said, "Baby, people love the illusion of safety and the spectacle of enclosure." They were given barcoded stickers for their cars. Their community had a country club. They joined because the transfer came with a promotion and a raise. Marcy's husband said it was important to live up to their new station. Mostly, he wanted to play golf with men whose bellies were fatter than his. In Palmetto Landing, the men's bodies expanded in inverse proportion to those of their wives. Each morning, there was a group fitness class at the clubhouse. Spinning, Zumba, kickboxing, always something different. The instructor was a young, aggressively fit woman, Caridad. The other wives loved to say her name, trilling their R's to show Caridad, "Ellas hablan español." Marcy stood in the back of the studio in sweatpants and an old t-shirt of her husband's, while the women around her perspired in their perfectly coordinated outfits that were fancier than most of Marcy's wardrobe. Marcy enjoyed the pleasant soreness as she drove the 5 blocks home after each class. She liked how, for an hour, there was a precise set of instructions she was meant to follow, a clear sense of direction. The other wives were quietly fascinated by Marcy in that she was a rare species in the wealthy enclave, a first wife. Ellen Katz, who lived 3 doors down, often squeezed Marcy's shoulder with her cool, bony hand. She'd say, "We're rooting for you, kid," and offer words of encouragement as Marcy's figure slimmed. Marcy never knew what to say during these moments, but she smiled politely because she understood these people and how they existed only in relation to those around them. Thank you. So I think of myself primarily as a fiction writer because fiction is my first love and it's what I started doing. but the world thinks of me as a nonfiction writer because I wrote this book, Bad Feminist, and I didn't think anything was going to happen with the book because you can go online and print it out. And so why would you buy it? Everything's been published. I mean, buy it, but I didn't think much of it. And when I came up with the title, the book was originally called What We Hunger For. And my publisher was like, that's too many words. And so I said, that's 4. And they were like, no, that's too many words. And so I said, let me think about this. And then I was like, feminism. I'm so bad at it. Bad feminist. And I didn't think anything further than that, other than, yes, it's 2 words. And that everywhere I would go, people would be like, it's the bad feminist. And sometimes when they say that, I look around and I'm like, where is she? I hope she's nice. My next book is called Hunger, so I've gotten it down to 1 letter, 1 word. And after that, I don't know what to do, other than to become like Prince and just go by a symbol, 1 N. Anyway, if you follow me on Twitter, that was a funny joke. So sorry for the 300 of you who don't know what that is. So I'm often asked to talk about the state of the world, and so I thought I would talk a little bit about the state of the world and then just take some questions from you, because I prefer to do a conversation rather than to just blab at you. But ever since the election, I've had a lot of thoughts and opinions, as you might imagine. A lot of thoughts and opinions. And so, on Tuesday, November 8th, 2016, Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. I spent the evening watching election returns, and with each passing hour, the hope of Hillary Clinton as our first woman president faded a little more. But I still held on to some hope, because that was much easier than facing reality. Although I do not think of myself as an idealist, I could not allow myself to believe that Trump could be elected. I didn't even think he could garner the Republican nomination. For some foolish reason, I believed that there were enough people across the country who believed in social progress and the greater good to overcome those who, for whatever reason, believed in Trump's hateful rhetoric. I was stunned, and then I was ashamed of being so stunned and so unprepared for this American reality. The morning after the election, my mother called and I ignored my phone because it was 8 a.m. and my parents always call me around 8 a.m. because they feel like I shouldn't be in bed after that time. I knew she was calling to check in on me. I knew she was worried because we had spoken throughout election night and I was taking it hard. A few minutes later, she texted me and said, "The sun is shining today. We are alive, still together, and definitely stronger. Wake up." I didn't want to wake up, or I wished it was a nightmare and I could wake up in the world that we lived in on November 7th. An imperfect world, to be sure, but a world where a reality television star was not the president-elect. I didn't want to wake up in the world where everything suddenly became precarious for too many people. On Wednesday, I went about my day. I had to accept that the world was not coming to an end, even though it felt that way. There were media interviews, even though I had no idea what to say, no way of making sense of the incomprehensible. What do we do next, I was asked. And what I wanted to say was, I have no fucking idea, but I couldn't because you're not allowed to curse on the radio. While I was running errands, the sun was indeed shining, the air was crisp, it was a perfect fall day, people were out living their lives. At the gym, everyone bantered as they usually do. The woman who works at the dry cleaner smiled at me and wished me a good day, as she usually does, and I wished her a good day, as I usually do. Life went on, or at least it seemed that way. I kept wanting to scream, "Don't you know what's going on?" And at the same time, because I live in a fairly small town in Indiana, I looked at each and every person and thought, you probably voted for Donald Trump. How could you? Do you have any idea what you have done? I didn't write a lot about the presidential campaign. I regret that now. I wanted to, but I didn't have words to express my support of and admiration for Hillary Clinton, or to express my frustration with the exceedingly narrow field of candidates the Democrats fielded, or to express my horror at Donald Trump and how he was consistently overcoming very shallow expectations. Now, though, I'm not really interested in relitigating the election. Instead, I'm interested in figuring out where we go from here. I am interested in figuring out how we survive this age of American disgrace. And let us be clear, to call what is currently happening a disgrace is my way of being polite. Less than a month into his presidency, Trump has done exactly what he said he was going to do. He has set into motion an executive order to build a wall between the United States and Mexico, even though it will not be a contiguous wall. He has tried to dismantle the Affordable Care Act. He has lied repeatedly. He has spent the past 2 weekends at his Florida estate where he has discussed matters of national and international security with no regard for actual security. He has tried to ban Muslims from entering the country, including green card holders. He has ordered ICE raids on undocumented immigrants, specifically targeting sanctuary cities, and had his national security advisor, Michael Flynn, resign because Flynn discussed sanctions with the Russian ambassador and then lied to Vice President Michael Pence. Flynn, if you missed it, led a vigorous chant of "lock her up" during the presidential campaign because, Hillary Clinton, and she wrote some emails. Throughout the campaign, I did think about language and how careless we got with words that we used. I thought about language because I'm a writer, and words are how I make sense of the world. They're how I make sense of myself. There were all kinds of pitchy catchphrases that became very popular. Michelle Obama said, "They go low, we go high," and for a woman in her position, that made sense. She was beholden to the role of First Lady, and she was right in her belief that sometimes there is no need to sink lower than your opponent. But millions of people went on to parrot these words with no real understanding of the world and how it often works. Too many people were and are invested in the idea of ideological purity and infallibility to realize that there can be no purity in fighting fascism. There is no high road with a man who appointed a white supremacist as his chief strategist in the White House. When they go low, we have to be willing to go lower if we have any hope of resisting their greedy, shallow, and insular brand of fascism. The phrase "love trumps hate" was equally loathsome because that is in fact rarely the case, and in saying that over and over, people were literally centering Trump. Language matters, and sometimes it becomes an empty container for whatever bullshit people want to fill it with. Go high, Trump hate, be nasty, wear a pantsuit. The election results prove that love does not trump hate, not at all. As catchy as it sounds, I am not a nasty woman because there is no reclamation in how Trump sees women. And while pantsuits are a charming, fashionable, rallying outfit, they are not going to get us to the promised land. I don't begrudge people who found comfort or solidarity in these words and ideas, but oh my God, we needed to do better then, and we need to do better now. We need to get uncomfortable, and that means moving beyond tidy words that make us feel like the world is a better, more unified place than it actually is. Those of us who are in the crosshairs of a Trump presidency are devastated, but our eyes are still wide open. Since the election, I have watched as pundits try to understand voters in these so-called flyover states, where, by the way, I have lived for most of my life, where I still live now. People in these states are not grand mysteries. We live our lives much in the same way that these supposed coastal elites do. We work and play and live and love, and though journalists and coastal people need a far stronger and more nuanced understanding of what it's like to live in conservative places, people in red states could also stand to understand the culture of more liberal places. Not enough people with visible platforms are facing the ugly truth of what happened in this election. The majority of white men and white women voted for Trump. Some feminists are shocked that white women would value their whiteness over their womanhood, but women of color and people of color are not surprised. The precedent for this can be traced back to slavery. What we are seeing is American racism and xenophobia and misogyny on full display. What is reaped must now be sown. I have also been thinking about the phrase identity politics, which is always used to dismiss the concerns and lived experiences of marginalized people and to derail the conversations about how identity affects the ways in which people move through the world. Identity politics is an accusation that implies that we can somehow separate ourselves from the very things that contribute to who we are. It implies that we can't both acknowledge and embrace our identities and be part of a broader community. We're going to hear that phrase a lot in the coming years as marginalized people vocalize why a Trump presidency is terrifying, and those who don't get it try to look the other way or absolve themselves in how they were complicit in everything that comes next. There are those who take safety for granted, and there are those who disparage safety because it is, like so many other rights, one that has always been inalienable to them. They wrongly assume that we all enjoy such luxury and are blindly seeking something even more extravagant. They cannot see that what we seek is sanctuary. We are wanting to breathe. I am a Black bisexual woman. I am Haitian American. I am a Libra. I grew up middle class and then upper middle class. I am a very lapsed Catholic. My identity is political because so much of who I am is part of the public discourse, subject to legislation, discrimination, and disadvantage. Clearly, this is not the entirety of my life and who I am. Don't get me wrong, I've actually got it really good. In fact, the work I do is not for me, not really. It's for the people who don't have the privilege that I do, who need someone to stand and speak and fight for them and with them. This is how I use my freedom to speak. This is how I try to create sanctuary. February is Black History Month, and in February, and frankly every month of the year, I am invited to events like these with vague mandates to speak on diversity. And that word becomes another empty container that people fill with whatever the hell they want. Basically, I am invited to talk to and teach white people about things that are largely pretty easy to figure out. Sorry. I, like many people of color, am asked for solutions to problems I had no hand in creating. I will be honest. I am so very tired of talking about diversity. I am so tired of the assumption that as a Black woman, I somehow have access to magical Negro wisdom about how to make the world a better and more inclusive place. I do not. The word diversity has, as of late, become so overused as to be meaningless. In a 2015 article for the New York Times Magazine, Anna Holmes wrote about the dilution of the word, attributing its loss of meaning to a combination of overuse, imprecision, inertia, and self-serving intentions. The word diversity is, in its most imprecise uses, a placeholder for issues of inclusion, recruitment, retention, and representation. Diversity is a problem seemingly without solutions. We talk about it and talk about it and talk about it, and nothing much ever seems to change. This is another way in which we are careless with language, as if by simply saying the word diversity, we're doing something or creating change. That's not how it works. Change requires intent and effort and material support, which in most cases is robust and long-term financial commitment. And always change requires a little or a lot of imagination, a willingness to think differently, react differently, act differently. I've also been thinking about allies, and I have decided, and I have long decided really, that I'm done with allyship, particularly when the term ally is used as a noun rather than a verb. I am done with people allowing themselves the comfortable distance offered by allyship. I don't want to allow myself that comfortable distance, which we cannot afford, not anymore. The challenges marginalized people are facing from this point forward have to be taken on by all of us as personal. We have to fight not only for, but with each other. Since November, people have asked me what we do next, and I have no idea, but I am always trying to find answers to that question. I know we have to fight, but I don't know what that fight looks like. I know we need sanctuary now more than ever. I know we need to raise our voices and keep those voices raised. I still need time to hurt and rage, but I also recognize that we can't do nothing while we're hurting and raging. I am thinking about the ways in which we, everyday citizens, can participate in the 2017 local elections, 2018 midterms, and of course the 2020 presidential election. I'm thinking about ways in which we can prioritize economic and social justice, about how we can keep protesting. I'm thinking about the need to strengthen our communities by understanding where that strength is most needed. I'm thinking about discipline and organization and financial support and how we need to protect ourselves and each other. When we use our words, we have to do so with care and intent. I have to believe that we will get through this and we will not only survive, but thrive. It is a fragile hope, but despite everything, I do need to hold on to a little hope. I need to be able to breathe. I need to believe that there is grace beyond disgrace. Thank you. And so I would love to take questions. I can answer questions on anything, including my husband, Channing, who's gorgeous, we all know, or other topics. Also, I remember Poland Springs so distinctly. It was the only water in New Hampshire when I went to high school, and it's still going strong. I'm just like, I'm so excited. Yay, Poland Springs! Keeping up the good fight. Don't be shy. Yes, stand up.
Hi, Roxane. Thank you so much for your wonderful words.
Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit, I know this question is going to be a little vague, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about humor, just in the sort of political or social discourse, which I think I really think is being tied to your concerns about kind of bad language that's kind of vacuous. Not doing very much, particularly since we have a regime right now in which there is so much that's very easily mocked and laughed at. So if you had some thoughts.
Yes, it's the golden age of comedy right now, I'm telling you. Look, the jokes are writing themselves, and all you have to do is read transcripts of the news. It's just like, really? This is actually happening? But I use humor in my work as sort of the spoonful of sugar to make the medicine go down. A lot of times it's really difficult to have political conversations because people are deeply entrenched in what they believe, and I include myself in that. This is one of my greatest flaws. I'm a yellow dog Democrat. It is what it is. And so how do you reach someone who is diametrically opposed to what you believe? And I think that we all like to laugh, and that humor is a great connector, and then you can start to have these difficult conversations. And so I use humor as a weapon. But a weapon for good, not evil. And I also think it's because people pay more attention to humor. I remember when The Daily Show first came out, and there were journalists who were demanding that Jon Stewart hold himself to the rigors of journalism. And there was a really great episode where he took on Tucker Carlson. And he said, I'm not a journalist, I'm a comedian. But when his show first started, and for many years, most people, not most people, I would say, there was a significant number of people who got their news from The Daily Show and who got their understanding of current events and the current socio-political climate from that show. And so I took my cue from that in terms of how I write about a lot of very fraught issues like feminism and social justice, to use humor in that way. Yes.
Hi, Roxane.
Hi.
I tweeted you 4 years ago, and you responded.
Oh.
And I'm really excited that you're here. So thank you for being here and thank you for speaking.
Of
I was
course.
wearing a bad feminist shirt, which I still have.
Oh, hot.
And you were like, thanks for that. And I was like, wow, the gods love me today. But I wanted to ask you, particularly because we're in an institute of higher education with, its troubled legacy, Williams College and higher institutions of education in general, and because I know you're a professor, what you think the role of student activism and activism on college campuses will play in the coming years, and specifically, how do you see the role of women of color, specifically, I guess queer women of color too, as I identify as one, in this work as students, as young people, and I'm thinking a lot about the emotional labor sometimes that we are asked to take on, which is not counted as labor.
Yes. Okay, so her question is about student activism and the role I see student activism playing, and what specifically is the role that women of color and queer women of color are going to play. I think student activism is enjoying quite the renaissance. We've seen it in the past couple years at Mizzou, at Yale, and actually at Yale they actually got Calhoun College changed. And I was like, thank God they didn't change JE, because I was JE. But the funny part about the Yale thing is that Yale was a slave owner too. So, well, yay for change. But student activism actually does get a lot done, especially within the context of campuses, because you are constituents and you are generally paying tuition dollars. And so the administration is beholden to you. And so I think it's a great place. When I was in high school and college, our big thing was divesting in South Africa. And so that was our big rallying cry. And we did get my high school to divest from South Africa and to divest their portfolio at the time from Coca-Cola, which had major investments in South Africa. And it felt like we were creating change, and eventually apartheid fell. And that was, wonderful. It really felt like we had done something. And so, although student activism is often mocked because people find the most absurd examples, and then they're like, oh my God, the world's coming to an end, student activism is actually a really great locus of change. And it does create a lot of change, and that change, I think, trickles beyond the borders of the university. The challenge is that it is oftentimes women and people of color who are leading this charge, in addition to having to provide the emotional labor of being tokens on a campus that's predominantly white, in addition to being seen as that person who's always got a cause, and then everyone's like, oh God, here she comes again, fucking run. It's just really hard to be that person, but it's also hard to sit by and do nothing. And so you're caught between a rock and a hard place. I do think that you have to pick your battles. And I was saying this to the young people I was speaking to earlier. You can't fight everything. You have to save something for yourself. And quite frankly, you have to save some energy for beyond college. The fight is really just starting. And it gets so much worse when you're out of sort of the confines of a very, it's not a safe space, but a very enclosed space, like a university. So you have to pick your battles, and also pick how much of yourself you give to those battles. You have to save something for yourself. And just, don't do everything. Another thing I notice is that, like, anytime I go to a campus, a student of color is like, I'm in 8 clubs, and I'm on the president or the executive board of 7 of them. And I'm like, then what the fuck? When do you sleep? When do you have sex? I mean, like, what are you doing with your life? And so you don't have to do it all. Yes?
Hi, Roxane.
Hi.
It's good to see you again. So, connected to that, I teach at a college down the road, and I'm wondering, as a faculty member, how you deal with an administration that's wanting to do the lip service of put you on the diversity committee or hire a diversity officer and other admin to do the work that maybe they can put in the faculty line or put into student resources, or like what your response is to the corporate diversification of the university.
Yeah, my response in general is to call them on it. And there's not much else I can do, or at least until I just got tenure, so now I can do a lot more. Sucker! But one of the key things that I've done at Purdue is they always want to put my picture on a goddamn brochure. And no, you don't get to do that. You do not get to use me and lie to students about like what this campus actually looks like. Purdue is very, very white. And there's nothing wrong. I mean, there's something wrong with that, but there's nothing wrong with that in many ways. It's in rural Indiana. Like, I don't want students of color to come there. I don't want to bring my students into situations where they're going to be uncomfortable and unsafe or just unhappy. Happiness is enough. And so I try to resist these attempts to sort of make me the token faculty member and the poster child of diversity. We're not a diverse university, and I'm not going to be part of this sort of elaborate lie. And I started doing that as a graduate student because I was the only black student in my PhD program, and I'm only the second black person to ever get a PhD from my university. And I graduated in 2010, lest you think this is ancient history. And I also refused to be in their brochures because I was the only one. And so if you put me on the brochure, you're going to make a student of color think, oh, yes, There's an Asian lady, and there's a Middle Eastern man, and there's another Asian lady and a black woman. This place is paradise. Like, no, girl, no. And so we just have to continue doing things like that. What I do, though, is I allow myself to be like the token minority on hiring committees. I always say yes to that, because that's where the real power is and where the real influence is. But I refuse to sit on bullshit committees about university diversity and strategic planning, because A, I don't have that kind of time, and B, I don't have that kind of time. You're welcome. Oh, thanks. You had a question? Yes.
Hi, I just wanted to know how your Haitian identity kind of helped you kind of pick your career and what you kind of want to do as a fellow
Yes.
Haitian American who also wants to pursue fiction writing.
Yes.
I'm very curious to see how your kind of Haitian parents or Haitian identity pushed you in certain directions.
Yes. So she's asking about how Haitian identity has shaped my career choices, basically. Well, you have Haitian parents, so you know. My parents wanted me to become a lawyer, doctor, or engineer, which I call the Haitian trifecta of appropriate careers. And now I'm like, I became a doctor, so what? And the funniest thing is that now they call me for medical advice. It's the most hilarious thing. Like, my mom will call me and she'll say, you know, Roxane, I got this prescription. Can I take two? And so I Google it and I give her what I feel is a legitimate answer, and then she feels like I've given her like a medical advice, and she's just like, oh, my daughter, the doctor. I'm like, But even though, it's a true story, even though my parents are very much interested in the trifecta, and they encouraged me, in fact, forced me to at least go down that path. My first major in college was biology in pre-med. They also encouraged my writing. They're the first people who ever gave me books and encouraged my love of books, and they gave me my first typewriter. And I was just very persistent. No matter what, I changed majors 4 times in 2 years. And then I became a writer. And I worked a series of odd jobs. I got a master's degree in creative writing and then a PhD in rhetoric and technical communication. And then I became a professor. And then they were like, well, it's not a doctor, but it's okay. And so as I kept persisting, and I think they saw my persistence and they respected my persistence, because Haitians also love persistence. And so I just always had to just fight the good fight while being a good Haitian daughter and not let them deter me. And sometimes you just have to stick to your guns and do what you want to do. But I understand what their underlying concern was. They wanted me to be able to pay my bills. And writing for many of us and for many years does not pay the bills. It does now, but it took 20 years to get to this place. And so make sure that you have a backup plan. Like, even my PhD was a backup plan, and it worked because I got my first job out of graduate school teaching rhetoric and technical communication. And then they realized I could teach creative writing, and I was just randomly lucky in that the creative writing faculty member at Eastern Illinois at the time got tenure and was like, fuck this, and quit. She just walked away, never came back. It's the most hilarious thing to me. And I get it now. And so that's how I fell into creative writing. But I always had a day job. I still have a day job, even though I know I don't need it anymore. But so have a backup plan. Have a way of paying your bills while you're trying to make it as a writer, and that will also make your parents feel a lot better. Yes? And then, in there.
Hi.
Hi.
How do you feel about POC creators, artists, maybe writing, pop culture, TV, that they're boxed in into identity, like they're only known as the Black TV art actor, as the Hispanic writer?
Yeah, so how do I feel about basically pigeonholing and being defined solely by your identity? I feel very strongly about that. Very early in my career, I told myself I was never going to be pigeonholed into being the Black writer who only writes about things that the industry feels are prescriptive for Black people to write about. And so that's why I write across so many genres and I write about so many things. And it's really important to resist the narratives that people are going to try and put on your creativity. As people of color, people tend to think that the only thing we can be expert on is race. And that is not the case. We have imaginations, and it's funny because Tolkien can come by and people are like, hobbits are real, and they fucking learn how to speak Elvish, which is not a real thing. And then they're like, when you write a white character as a person of color, they're like, oh my God, how did you manage this feat? I turned on the TV, and so you just have to resist categorization and don't ever pander or write what people expect you to write. Write what you want to write or create what you want to create. It's very difficult though. I remember early in my career, because I'm from Nebraska and I grew up in the suburbs, I tend to write domestic stories about people in the suburbs. And an editor said, I need there to be more ghetto in this story. And I was like, what? I don't understand. He's like, I want it to be more authentic, like your real life. His name was Stephen. No. Yes?
So my question is that some of the most vulnerable people to things like the ACA dismantling and climate change have been convinced to vote against their interests in Donald Trump. And you mentioned that you use humor as a tool to converse about these things. And I was wondering, because a lot of these people are voting because they feel antagonized, is there a way to balance having a discourse with, calling these people out on things that need to be called out on?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a way. I think we're going to have to figure that out very quickly, though. There are a lot of people, and I live among them in Indiana, who voted against their own interests. But I also think that they didn't necessarily vote only against their own interests. They voted for something. They voted for the xenophobia of Donald Trump. The number one thing I think that influenced a lot of voters was this idea of the murdering immigrant, which is such a bizarre narrative. And I remember listening to a radio show with a woman from a rural town in Ohio with, I think, like 300 people, and no people of color in this town. And she was legitimately afraid of Mexican immigrants coming into the town to murder her. And I'm like, girl, from where? Like, nobody is coming to your town at all. At all. And so I think before we can even talk about them voting against their own interests, we have to talk about what they were actually voting for. A lot of people really tried to frame the election as something about economic anxiety when the majority of Donald Trump voters made more than $50,000 a year. And we have to talk about that and talk about that again and again. Hillary won the majority of working class voters. There's a lot of misinformation because too many people are getting only Fox News. And so there were a lot of people who didn't realize that Obamacare is the Affordable Care Act. We're working with a basic literacy problem, and that is an information literacy problem. And so another key thing we have to do is just find ways to get people to look at news sources beyond Fox News and to read beyond like whatever psychotic website was being posted by their friends on Facebook. And I don't know how to combat that, but I'm very interested in trying to figure it out because, if there was just more credible information out there, and also if people didn't hate Hillary Clinton so much, we would have seen a vastly different outcome.
I probably, like almost everyone in this room, follow you on Twitter. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, you have more resilience on social media than I can imagine ever having. You have to deal with a lot of stuff that a lot of women and a lot of women of color have to deal with in terms of trolling and sort of what I think of as denial of service attacks or people around you, and yet you persist. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that reality of being a woman on Twitter.
Yes, so the reality of being a woman on Twitter. Twitter, I love Twitter. And I started using Twitter during graduate school because I was in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, which is 10 hours north of Detroit. It's smaller than here. to give you a sense of scale. Well, no, it's about the same size because we actually had a Walmart. It was isolating, and so I wanted to feel connected to some sense of community, and I'm also shy and a loner, and Twitter allows you to feel like you're at a very nice cocktail party, but in your pajamas. And so I loved that. With more visibility, and as my career has grown, every dumbass Dick and Harry feels like he needs to get in my face about everything. And I am very opinionated. I have no problem with people coming at me with their opinions. But what happens on Twitter is that the social fabric erodes. And people, like the number one go-to, of course, is you're fat, which like, I got the memo. And you're ugly, which is not true. And just things like that. They're not even engaging with my ideas. And so in many ways, it's easy to ignore that because they're just saying the most obvious, stupid things. At the same time, I'm a girl and it hurts my feelings. And so sometimes I just get very deep in my feelings. And my girlfriend often tells me, stop talking to eggs. And so she has given me this rule where I'm no longer allowed to communicate with people who don't have a picture on Twitter. And so if she ever sees me fighting, she'll text me, "You're talking to an egg." And it also gives me perspective. Like I'm really getting involved in some elaborate word battle with someone who A, can't spell, and B, can't take the time to put a picture online. Yeah, girl, stop. And other times I just try to push back because one of the reasons that trolls succeed in pushing people off social media is because they're relentless. And so my ethos is that I'm going to be relentless too. I am the cockroach of Twitter. Until nuclear winter comes, I will still be on Twitter telling you about this amazing yogurt that I had last night, which was Faya 2% cherry. Boom. You're welcome. Yes?
So I actually had a question with your identification or with the phrase and the ownership of the phrase bad feminist, both in your book as well as in the Guardian article. And I'm interested in what you think about not following party lines, even in more radical quote-unquote circles, so disobedience or non-compliance with a party line, whether that's feminism or different things like that.
I think that non-conformity is really important. I think there are times when it's important to get along, just to keep things moving. But sometimes the party line doesn't serve your best interests, and it's important to resist and to say no. And so when I came up with the term bad feminist, it was partly tongue-in-cheek, like, haha, that's funny, because I like to make myself laugh. But it was partly a way of rejecting mainstream feminism that has for so long been very singular in its concerns for, in general, heterosexual middle-class white women. And if that's good feminism, then I'm going to be a bad feminist who perhaps recognizes that white women are not the only women in the world. And I found that to be just useful. And it was a way of being nonconformist while also recognizing that we are contributing to a greater feminist project and that collectivity works a lot better than individualism. And so I like to nonconform while also acknowledging that I am part of something bigger than myself. Redhead, because I saw you, and then some others.
I was wondering if you could speak to language and the dialogue around acceptable protest and like how media kind of classifies some protests as rioting and how that, puts a bad light on what the protest is actually saying.
Yes. I think that the issue of how protest is framed as acceptable or as rioting is all about race, honestly. Because the Black Lives Matter movement did the exact same thing that the Women's March did, but the Black Lives Matter protesters were framed as angry. Well, yeah, you keep shooting us, so we're going to probably have some feelings about that. But it was blackness that was the difference. And after the Women's March, I remember reading all of these news articles about how there were no arrests. There were no arrests because the police committed no arrests, not because the marchers were saints. And so when I'm thinking about protest, it's really interesting. It depends on what you're protesting for and who's making up part of the protest, and that's what really decides what's acceptable and unacceptable. And that's why we have to push back, and that's why we have to support people of color when they decide to protest, and make sure that we're framing it in ways that are genuine and true to what's happening, and making sure that we're legitimizing those protests the same way that we're legitimizing protests that we're comfortable with. Protest is meant to make us uncomfortable. It really is. And this idea that protest has to be neat and orderly and docile and has to follow rules, that's not what protest is. That's never been what protest is. One of the main reasons that the Muslim ban has really been stalled permanently until they come up with a more effective draft that they should have come up with in the first place is because people, and I'm still surprised by it, got up and went to airports and protested and stood there. And I found that protest, I thought the Women's March was wonderful, but I found those protests to be far more potent and having really measurable outcomes. And so we have to get uncomfortable and get a little bit unruly or a lot unruly to be heard, because that's the only way that this administration is going to respond. And it's not even about Republican versus Democrat, because what's happening now is so far beyond like that kind of division. What we're seeing is oligarchy versus democracy. And that's why we just really have to protest and be unruly and fight back against people who want to frame these kinds of things as riots when they're not riots. Yes?
Firstly, I just want to say thank you for existing as a human being. And secondly, for like working with Marvel, because they've been taking way too long to like really expand and push forward like more stories for like their heroes of color. And we're just now getting like a Black Panther movie like next year, even though it's been around since like literally the 60s. And just I'm very excited for like another world of Wakanda, because literally you have power, raise hell, go. I'm so excited. But my biggest my question that I wanted to ask you is just like, as like a queer woman, just about like your own personal experiences with like racism or like prejudice like in queer spaces, because I feel like a lot of like queer like white people and even like brown people like don't understand that you can also be racist or have like anti-black prejudices like towards people like just because they're queer, that they think that they can't also have privilege within these spaces. So just like speaking towards like your own personal like experiences with that.
Yes, so our question is really about encountering racism in queer spaces, and how do you deal with queer people who don't recognize that you can be queer and still hold privilege. The first thing I do is point them to my book, Bad Feminist, and my essay, Peculiar Benefits, that's also available online. Because I think it's important to have nuanced conversations about privilege. One of the key things that I try to do in everything I do is ground myself in privilege. There's a reason why I'm up here on this stage. It's not accidental. I grew up in a two-parent household, in an upper middle class household. I went to Exeter and Yale and the University of Nebraska and Michigan Technological University. And I was loved and supported, and I was from a family who could afford to send me to all of these schools. And then I was able to get a fellowship for graduate school and not have to pay for it. Everything in my life has been such that I should be up here on this stage and I should be successful, because nothing has ever told me I couldn't be successful. There have never been any barriers. But that doesn't mean I'm not marginalized in other ways. And one of the key things I always try to remind people is that as much as you experience privilege, you can also experience disadvantage. And I find that queer communities are very resistant to this. They're very resistant to acknowledging privilege because they're focused on marginalization. And what's very odd is this sort of younger generation of queerlings right now who don't even have a sense of history and the fights that came before to recognize how good it is now. It's not great. We have a lot of work to do, but my God, what it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 60, 70 years ago, it's just night and day. And so you have to push back in those situations. You have to point out racism, and you have to say that your queerness does not buy you out of your racism. We're seeing this a lot right now with Milo Yiannopoulos, who is a member of the alt-right, or the Nazi party, if you will. And he's a gay man, and people are always like, you're being homophobic when you speak against Milo. No, he's a white supremacist. I'm not being homophobic, I am being right. And we have to resist these things. We absolutely do. And it just comes back again to also intersectionality, which is a stupid word, but a really important idea. Yes.
Before you talked about getting a little militant and overt, and the last question was sort of talked about being a little unruly. I'm a very kind of person and have like a fantasy of a militant life, and I was wondering if you do, and like how would you go about handling around it?
Yeah, I'm actually more of a centrist in my life, but I'm trying to get more unruly. This is like me trying to grow as a person at 42. I have a fantasy of people on the left getting less comfortable, because we are very comfortable right now, and we're very smug. Like, oh, I have the right ideas and I have the right politics, and I'm a smug motherfucker too, I admit it. And I want to see us move beyond that, move beyond this sort of righteousness, and figure out what can we do with all of this energy that we have to like really create change. So many of us are, I think, being very complacent and very happy to just like be on social media and hashtag some shit and think you're doing something. You're not. And so I just want to see us all just get more active and more in your face. And I am actually very encouraged by the past 2 months, and especially the past month, and the ways in which the left were finally saying, you know what, we're enough. People are actually getting out of their comfort zones. I want to see this momentum continuing to build instead of people getting protest exhaustion. And that's one of my biggest fears right now. And so my fantasy is that we just keep this going, and sort of we say, oh, it's Friday, time to go march. Yes?
Yeah, since you brought up Milo, let me see if I can put this right. With Berkeley, he was supposed to speak, and they were protesting, and it really wasn't going anywhere. And then the Black Bloc showed up, and when they showed up, and they, my understanding is they're more apt to show force and perhaps violence. Breaking, even if breaking windows or whatever like that. Who? It's called the Black Bloc, and they wear black and they cover their faces. So I used to think of them as anarchists, but I guess there's a new name, and it's called the Black Bloc. And they are given the credit for Milo not being able to speak at Berkeley that night. And so there's some people saying that the Black Bloc has a place with whatever's going on in the country now. And then there's other people who are saying it's giving protests and such a bad name, having an influence that it's negative, not like Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi that said peace, peace, peace. And earlier tonight, I heard you say, and this is where I want you to just be more clear in my mind, do you think there is a role because it's really like an oligarchy for the Black Bloc? Or are you saying we really need to continue peaceful?
Oh, I'm saying we need to get unruly, and that peaceful protest doesn't mean that we, people misinterpret what peaceful protest means. Peaceful protest means like no guns. But I mean, so what if a window's broken? It's a goddamn window. I think that anarchy, I'm not an anarchist, but I think that groups like the Black Bloc come in and they get things done. And they, have the energy. People also grossly misunderstand Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King believed in nonviolence, but he wasn't a pushover. And protest is not trying to have a good reputation. That's not what protest is. Protest is trying to create change, and sometimes you have to break a few windows, and you have to throw a few chairs, and you have to do a little damage. But nonviolence means not killing people, not hurting people physically. That's where the limits are. And There are some people who certainly disagree with that, and I understand that. But for me, nonviolence means not hurting other people. I'm not worried about violence against property, because property is not. It's property is property. Let's get a grip. I think we have to protest by any means necessary to get the attention. And turns out people care more about property than people. So yes, let's break some windows.
One of your essays I was most compelled by was the illusion of safety when you talked about trigger warnings. And it wasn't something I really encountered until I came to Williams in a classroom setting.
Really?
Yeah, by high school, I guess they didn't really use them.
No, I meant they gave you encounter trigger warnings in the actual classroom?
Oh, okay. Twice in an art history class where we studied painting the brave. Okay. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk about your opinion on those and the potential dangers of them.
Yes, so her question is really about trigger warnings in the classroom. I don't believe in trigger warnings, and I still don't. And I've never used them in my classroom, and I never will, because I'm teaching adults. The thing is, and we just don't have nuanced discussions about this, I would never put anything in front of my students that they are not prepared for. My pedagogy includes preparing my students for anything. Like if we're going to read a novel, like right now we're reading a novel called Disgrace by J.M. Kedzie, because I'm teaching a class on writing the protest novel. And so we talked about what the novel's going to be about. It's set in post-apartheid South Africa, and there is a graphic rape in the novel. And so we just had a discussion about the writing of violence and the depiction of violence and whether or not it was handled well and that sort of thing, so that when they sit down with the book, they're prepared for it. I think that the danger of using trigger warnings in classrooms is that you start to segregate off difficult topics, and you say that this is too dangerous for you. You can't handle this. And it creates the illusion that the world is safer than it actually is. But I understand why people use them as well. It's just not for me, and I don't find that it's pedagogically advantageous. And it's never come up. I've never had a student ask for one. But again, I feel like I prepare my students adequately. I'm never going to throw them in the deep end and be like, here, read this deeply traumatizing thing to help you have a good time. They're prepared for it in advance. I think that teachers who do use trigger warnings, they're doing so with a lot of care. They are thinking primarily about students. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that we're really having a debate about whether or not people care too much about their students. God, I wish this was the biggest problem we had. We'd be doing very well as a people if this was our biggest issue. Yes, in the back.
So you write very often about yourself privately and about people in your life. How do you decide how much you want to share both about your family or other people and also about yourself, how much you want to put out there? And then you talked about being tired and what you just wrote, also how much energy you want to give to that.
Yeah, so how do I decide what to write about in terms of drawing from my personal life? I make just very careful choices, and I have very strict boundaries about what I will and won't write about. And those boundaries allow me a sense of freedom because I know that I'm always going to protect the parts of my life and the parts of myself that need to be protected. When I do I rarely write about my family, but when I do so with the knowledge that I like my family. And my parents call me every day. And so that conversation is going to be a lot more pleasant if I haven't put something crazy about them on the internet. And so that's oftentimes my metric. Will this shame my parents and their friends, who they love to brag about me to? And I just have a code, and I follow that code. And it's important for every writer who's going to choose to write from their lives to have that code. Otherwise, you will cannibalize yourself and give far too much of yourself and have nothing left that's sacred, and save something sacred for yourself.
You mentioned before writing a character who's not the same ethnicity as you. Who is of a different race, writing a character of a different race.
Yes.
I wonder if you remember the whole Lionel Shriver episode in Australia where she gave that talk and they were writing some reactions. So do you think the whole discussion was there was nuance in the discussion, and if you have any opinions on the whole issue?
Yes, so he's writing about writing across difference and Last year, a writer, Lionel Shriver, gave a talk at a literary festival in Sydney, I think it was Sydney, and she wore a sombrero, and she was very in her feelings about people not being able to write across difference without being criticized. I thought that conversation was utterly lacking in nuance, and I thought what she said was very offensive. Because what she wanted was to be able to write across difference without being criticized. And that's the same as people who are like free speech when they say something horrific and then get pushback. You said the thing, so you used your freedom of speech, and then we used our freedom of speech to respond. And as a writer, you are free to write anything you want. So you can be a white woman and you can write about black people. But if you do it stupidly, which she did, you're going to get some pushback. And so the pushback she was getting is that in her last novel, she wrote about a black woman who has Alzheimer's and her white husband who would lead her around on a leash. Right, just let it sink in. And she got a lot of pushback because of that. And then she got hurt, her emotional feelings, etc. And it's just, these kinds of things are just nutty. And it just does a disservice to writing. It does disservice to the craft. It does disservice to thinking about these conversations in ways that are important and necessary. And then she makes everyone seem insane. When people are like, no, you can't write about difference. It's like, girl, Lionel, you cannot write about difference. You cannot. You had your chance and you messed it up. And not only did she mess it up, she did so without humility. I always tell my students, because they're very afraid of writing across difference, I say, of course you can write across difference, and you should. It's called fiction for a reason. Again, going back to the Hobbits, there's Treebeard and all of these things, and we're like, talk about them like they're real. So yes, you can imagine the lives of others, but you have to do so in ways that are not caricatured and full of stereotypes and just downright offensive. Too few people just sit down and take the care that is demanded of writing difference. And she didn't take the care, and then she didn't listen to the feedback about maybe the optics of a black woman being led around on a leash in a non-S&M context is a bad idea. Yes. Yes.
One question. You sort of gestured at this when you talked about sort of which diversity committees you would go to and which ones you wouldn't show up for. But I'm wondering how you make decisions sort of as you come into the public eye and into fame, how you decide sort of which events and sort of events like this one will be meaningful for you, and how you choose to spend your time sort of dividing between private and public, and if that's changed as you've become more famous.
Oh yes, well, famous. For me, the deciding factor is money. Pay me. My time is very valuable, and I charge a lot of money. Why? Because I have to leave my life and my students and my home and my very comfortable bed and give a lot of energy and put time and thought and preparation, and everybody's like, don't do a reading, give us a lecture. So you have to then write something. And I'm happy to do it, trust me, don't cry for me. It's a very good life. But I used to do this work for free, and I'm done with that. And I also decided last year I'm no longer going to sit on panels about diversity at conferences. We need to stop talking about diversity. We know what to do. Put some goddamn money behind it and think about retention. That's it. Stop telling me what can we do? You know what to do. And so there's nothing I could say on a panel about diversity that I haven't said, and that every other person of color in the world has not already said. And so one of the exciting things about increased visibility is being able to say no. But I do also recommend other people who might be a good fit for that and who might have a little more patience than I do for just having these same old conversations over and over. Another thing that I think about is I do work for free sometimes, and that's for kids. When I go to, I'm going to Pittsburgh in March 6th, and there's like a YMCA that would like me to meet with some kids from the community, of course, absolutely. That's a no-brainer. I did an event in New York the other day, and I met with high school students who are all students of color and first generation, like myself, and also writers, and that was one of the best times I've had. And so when I can give of my time and expertise to people who are going to benefit from it and who couldn't afford to pay a ridiculous fee, then I'm happy to do that as well. I want to be able to do things where I feel like I'm contributing in some meaningful way. And so that's really becoming my barometer, and it is a luxury and a privilege to be able to have that barometer, because for many years I did not, and I just had to say yes to everything. And so it's exciting to just have choices. Thank you very much.